Welcome tonight. As you settle in, let the rush of the day fade away. Tonight, we journey back to the very moment America was truly forged through the quiet, fierce struggle of a single man. Forget the famous names for a moment. This is the story of Elias Thorne, a carpenter whose life became a whisper in the shadow of giants. He endured the freezing trenches of Valley Forge and risked everything as a spy. The promise of freedom led Elias to poverty and betrayal. Can one man's sacrifice save a nation that has already forgotten him? Close your eyes. Listen to the true, untold price of self-governance. Elias Thorne's world was built with his own two hands. In the year 1765, his life was a testament to colonial sufficiency. A two-story house in the north end of Boston, a busy workshop, and a reputation built on sturdy construction and honest dealing. At 32, he was a master carpenter, a man whose word was as good as the tightest dovetail joint he ever cut. The heart of his home, and indeed his life, was the hearth. It was where the heat for the home was drawn, where the meals were cooked, and where his family gathered every evening. Sarah, his wife, was the steady, pragmatic anchor. Her calm presence balanced Elias's reserved intensity. They had two children, Thomas, a quiet, observant boy of 10 who spent hours watching his father work, and Lydia, a curious 6-year-old whose laughter was the freest sound in the house. For Elias, the unburdened prosperity of his family, the warmth of their fire, the full cupboard, was the measure of a just and ordered life under the distant but benevolent authority of the British Crown. That stable order began to crack in the summer of 1765. The source of the disruption was not local. It came from Parliament in Westminster, attempting to solve the massive debts incurred during the French and Indian War. The arrival of the Stamp Act hit Elias's trade and his consciousness like a poorly aimed hammer blow. The law required that virtually all printed materials, legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards be produced on special stamped paper purchased from Crown officials. For a tradesman, the effect was immediate. Contracts, deeds, and even advertisements now cost significantly more. Elias needed to finalize the deed for a lumberyard expansion. When the clerk demanded an exorbitant fee for the officially stamped paper, Elias felt a slow, simmering heat rise in his chest. The heavy official seal on the document was a visible sign of his subservience. "Why, sir, am I taxed on a simple piece of paper needed for my livelihood?" Elias demanded, his voice low. The clerk merely shrugged. "The cost of the king's protection, Mr. Thorne. It is the law passed by Parliament." Elias walked away with the deed, but the transaction felt like a personal humiliation. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle of representation. As an Englishman, he held the inherited right not to be taxed without his consent. Yet, here was Parliament, imposing a tax without a single colonial voice present. The principle, no taxation without representation, was no longer an abstract idea. It was the direct cause of the financial strain in his workshop and the subtle fear in his home. The initial organized resistance in Boston was loud and furious. Elias, cautious by nature, stayed clear of the violent mobs who hung effigies of tax collectors and destroyed the homes of officials. However, he was drawn inexorably toward the centers of civic resistance. He began attending gatherings beneath the massive Liberty Tree, a centuries-old elm in the South End. This was where the Sons of Liberty met, a group of artisans, lawyers, and merchants led by men like Samuel Adams and James Otis. Elias, standing on the edge of the crowd, listened not just to the cries of outrage, but to the cold, measured logic of their arguments, which were rooted in English common law and natural rights. His growing sympathy for the patriot cause created the first chill in his extended family. His cousin, Jeremiah Thorne, a wealthy merchant who held contracts with the Royal Navy, was a steadfast loyalist. Jeremiah viewed the protesters as dangerous anarchists. "They are mobs, Elias, destroying property and subverting the king's peace." Jeremiah thundered one day in Elias's shop. "We must have order. We owe the crown obedience for the prosperity we enjoy." Elias, carefully planing a smooth piece of cherry wood, kept his voice even. "The prosperity is ours because we earned it, Jeremiah, not because the king gifted it. And if obedience is demanded without consent, that is not law, it is tyranny." The rift was clear: allegiance to the crown's authority versus allegiance to one's fundamental rights. The repeal of the Stamp Act brought brief joy, but Parliament immediately asserted its authority with the Declaratory Act. Over the next few years, Parliament repeatedly pushed its control, culminating in the Townshend Acts, 1767, which taxed goods like glass, paper, and tea. By 1770, the situation in Boston had devolved into a military occupation. British redcoats patrolled the narrow streets, their presence a constant, armed provocation. The tension culminated in the Boston Massacre. While Elias was not present, the sight of dead citizens, ordinary men like himself, left an indelible mark. The blood spilled on King Street cemented the idea that the fight was now one of life and death, not merely economic protest. Elias's choice, though inevitable, was still a terrifying commitment. He could no longer simply stand and watch. He began performing discreet extra work for Paul Revere, building hidden compartments into desks and bookshelves designed to secretly store patriot pamphlets and correspondence. His craft became his weapon. The slow-motion crisis reached its breaking point in 1773 with the Tea Act. Parliament granted the struggling East India Company a monopoly on tea sales. Though the tea was cheaper, the tax remained, making the principle brutally clear: the king demanded submission. Elias listened in grim silence as Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea ships to leave Boston Harbor until the duty was paid. The mass meeting at the Old South Meeting House on December 16th was the final, formal rejection of the Crown's authority. That night, Elias looked at the glowing embers of his hearth. He saw the face of Sarah, the potential ruin of his business, and the hopeful faces of his children. His commitment to the cause had been intellectual and covert. It was now time for physical action. He grabbed his heavy work axe, smeared his face with soot and paint, and slipped out into the dark Boston night to join the Sons of Liberty. That night, destroying the tea in the harbor, Elias Thorne ceased to be merely a Boston carpenter. He became a revolutionary. He had crossed the point of no return, choosing the terrifying uncertainty of liberty over the comfortable order of the crown. The silent hearth of his home was about to be engulfed in the fires of a long, desperate war. The destruction of the tea in 1773 irrevocably altered Elias Thorne's life. The British response, the Intolerable Acts, had shut down Boston Harbor, transforming the city into a garrison under the command of General Thomas Gage. Elias's carpentry business, dependent on shipping and trade, collapsed. His worth was no longer measured by the furniture he crafted, but by his loyalty to the cause. Elias had already become a dedicated, if discreet, patriot. Now, he formalized his commitment by joining the local militia unit designated as Minutemen. They were an assemblage of tradesmen and farmers, ill-equipped but fiercely determined, pledged to gather and fight at a minute's notice. Elias, with his steady hands and proven loyalty, was given the rank of corporal. He spent his evenings drilling in secret fields outside Boston, learning to load his heavy old musket and march in formation, a clumsy, desperate preparation for war against the world's most professional army. The waiting was a constant psychological strain. Every patrol, every shipment of British supplies, every secret message carried the threat of the first shot. Elias made his peace with Sarah, a quiet, tearless understanding that his life was now forfeit to the cause. The farewells were unspoken, understood in the weight of every shared glance. The tension snapped on the evening of April 18th, 1775. General Gage, knowing the rebellion was stockpiling arms and protecting its leaders, ordered a column of about 700 elite regulars to march inland to Concord to seize the munitions and capture. Patriot leaders John Hancock and Samuel Adams in Lexington. Elias was a part of the frantic network of alarms. He raced through the dark city streets to the North Church, helping his comrade Paul Revere set the signal. He saw 2 lanterns hoisted into the belfry, a flash of light against the oppressive darkness, confirming the British were moving by sea across the Charles River. Elias then spent a desperate, adrenaline-fueled night running westward, warning fellow militiamen in the small towns along the route. His voice was hoarse from shouting the dire message, "The regulars are out! To arms!" The transformation from citizen to warrior was complete. The musket now felt more natural in his hand than the plane. Elias arrived in Lexington in the pre-dawn mist of April 19th, exhausted but alert. He joined Captain John Parker's tiny company of about 70 Minutemen assembled on the village green. They were a pathetic challenge to the approaching, perfectly disciplined British column. The two forces stood eye to eye. Elias felt the cold grip of fear as Major Pitcairn of the British forces rode forward and shouted, "Disperse, ye villains! Lay down your arms!" Captain Parker, seeing the overwhelming odds, ordered his men to scatter but to keep their muskets. As the Americans began to fall back, a single shot rang out, the source forever unknown. This single sound ignited the first blaze of the war. The British line instantly erupted in a massive, shattering volley of musket fire. Elias saw the man next to him, a simple farmer he knew only as William, crumple and fall, his face pale against the dew-damp grass. The chaotic, overwhelming force of the professional army was a shock. 8 Americans lay dead and 10 wounded within minutes. Elias, blinded by smoke and paralyzed by the sudden, terrifying carnage, fled with the survivors, the shame of the rout eclipsed by the visceral trauma of witnessing death. He had seen the reality of the British military machine. It was swift, merciless, and terrifyingly efficient. The Minutemen did not stay broken. They retreated, regrouped, and, fueled by fury, were soon joined by thousands of militiamen pouring in from the surrounding counties. By the time the British reached Concord, their mission a partial failure, the arms cache mostly removed, they found the colonial resistance organized and waiting. The clash at the North Bridge was the turning point of the day. Elias found himself firing from behind a stone wall, his aim steady, his previous terror replaced by a cold, protective rage. He aimed at the dense red ranks driven by the memory of the dead on Lexington Green. The concentrated, continuous fire from the Patriots was devastating. The Redcoats were forced to retreat back toward Boston in what became a 20-mile running battle. For the rest of the day, Elias and thousands of other militiamen lined the roads and ridges, utilizing guerrilla tactics to great effect. He spent hours reloading and firing, his shoulder bruised by the musket's recoil, witnessing a constant, horrific exchange of fire. By the time the British column stumbled back into Boston under the cover of night, suffering nearly 300 casualties, the myth of their invincibility was shattered. The immediate consequence of the shot heard round the world was a large-scale siege. Thousands of colonial fighters poured in, surrounding the British in Boston. To strengthen their position, the Americans decided to fortify Bunker Hill, actually Breed's Hill. Elias was part of the force sent to dig trenches throughout the night of June the 16th. The next day, General Gage launched a massive frontal assault to dislodge the Americans. Elias fought from behind a makeshift earthen wall, his fear replaced by a desperate, weary resolve. The order was legendary, though likely apocryphal in its exact wording. Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes. The Americans held their fire, waiting until the British were yards away, then unleashed devastating volleys that shredded the attacking ranks. Elias fired until his powder was nearly spent. Witnessing the British charge, retreat, and charge again, they held off 2 assaults, but the third succeeded only because the American ammunition finally ran out. Elias fought hand-to-hand with a British regular before retreating in a desperate, disorganized withdrawal across the peninsula. The British won the ground, but at a horrifying cost. Over 1,000 casualties, a quarter of the men engaged. Elias, looking back at the smoke rising over the hill, was physically and emotionally shattered. The battle was a disaster in terms of loss of life and territory, but it proved the colonial tenacity. Elias realized the stark military struggle ahead. This would be a long, brutal war fought not by brilliant generals and grand maneuvers, but by the relentless endurance and sacrifice of ordinary men like himself. He was no longer just a carpenter. He was a soldier in a cause demanding everything. The elation of driving the British out of Boston was a bitter memory. By the close of 1777, Elias Thorne, now a corporal in the Continental Army, had endured the long, crushing defeats near Philadelphia, Brandywine, and Germantown. The British had occupied the colonial capital, and General George Washington was forced to retreat, maneuvering his ragged army to a defensible winter encampment at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. When Elias arrived in mid-December, the site was nothing but a cold, desolate plateau exposed to the elements. They were not greeted by barracks or shelter, but by a chilling mandate. They had to build their own sanctuary. For Elias, the carpenter, the familiar scent of felled timber and the rhythm of the axe were a cruel reminder of his warm, distant workshop. Alongside his fellow soldiers, he raced against the deepening cold, chopping wood and constructing crude, cramped log huts, each designed to house a dozen men. The work was exhausting, but the alternative was death by exposure. The true enemy at Valley Forge was not the Redcoats. It was the catastrophic collapse of the Continental Army's supply line. The worthless currency and a dysfunctional Congress meant provisions rarely arrived. Elias, accustomed to the gnawing hunger of the long march, now experienced starvation as a permanent, debilitating companion. Rations dwindled to a thin, watery gruel or a crust of fire cake, flour mixed with water and baked over embers. He saw men boil their own leather accoutrements, shoes and cartridge boxes, to extract a meager, nauseating broth. The constant, aching hunger reduced the men to gaunt shadows. Compounding the hunger was the brutal cold and the lack of proper clothing. Elias's boots disintegrated early on, forcing him to wrap his feet in strips of linen. He would leave a visible crimson trail in the snow on his way to drill, the blood slowly freezing in his footprints. Sickness was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox swept through the overcrowded, unsanitary huts. For every man who deserted or fell to a British bullet, 10 fell to disease. Elias would later reflect that the suffering felt less like a struggle against an army and more like a siege by death itself. Amidst the physical devastation, the army's morale plummeted. Mutiny was a constant low murmur, yet the army did not dissolve. The single greatest reason for its endurance was the unwavering presence of General George Washington. Washington embodied the cause with monumental integrity. He shared the troops' hardships, maintaining his headquarters in a simple house that was little better than the soldiers' huts, and he was visible daily riding through the frozen camp. Elias never spoke directly to the general, but his frequent sightings of the commander-in-chief, his quiet resolve, his visible exhaustion, his refusal to abandon the post, served as a potent, silent rallying point. The soldiers had fought for American liberty, but they endured the winter for Washington, trusting that if their leader suffered, the cause was not yet lost. Washington was the anchor that held the nascent American soul together. In February 1778, a new dynamic shattered the deadly inertia. The arrival of Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a flamboyant Prussian military officer claiming to be a former general. Though his claims were exaggerated, his skill was undeniable. Von Steuben was appalled by the army's ragged inefficiency. Von Steuben, barely speaking English, immediately set about a relentless, systematic training program. He began by personally drilling a company, often resorting to loud, colorful German curses that had to be frantically translated by his aide, Captain Walker. Elias was a part of this harsh, necessary transformation. Von Steuben taught them true military discipline, teaching the Continentals to march in formation, how to load and fire their muskets in a cohesive unit, and, most importantly, the proper use of the bayonet, a weapon the Americans had previously neglected. The rigorous, constant drilling was exhausting, especially on empty stomachs, but it instilled a vital sense of professionalism and pride. "He makes us soldiers, not just angry farmers," muttered Nathaniel, Elias's Virginian hutmate. "We learn to fight with our minds, not just our rage." Valley Forge served as a profound crucible for the creation of a unified American identity. Elias, the Massachusetts carpenter, suffered the same hunger as Nathaniel, the Virginian farmer, and the same cold as the Pennsylvanian frontiersman. Their shared misery transcended regional prejudices. The men who survived this winter emerged not as New Yorkers or Virginians, but as Continentals, a brotherhood bound by shared blood, shared hunger, and a radical shared commitment to the ideals of the Revolution. They proved, in the most visceral way, that they were willing to sacrifice everything for the abstract concept of a republic. When spring finally arrived in 1778, the army that marched out of Valley Forge was smaller, scarred, and still ragged. But it was no longer a disorganized collection of militias. It was a disciplined, hardened, and unified fighting force. The subsequent news of the official French alliance served as a final validation of their endurance. Elias Thorne, his body leaner and his spirit tempered by the brutal winter, carried the permanent mark of Valley Forge. The suffering had not broken the army, it had forged the enduring American soul. The soldier was now ready to take the fight directly to the enemy. The discipline forged at Valley Forge had transformed Elias Thorne, but after the indecisive Battle of Monmouth in 1778, General George Washington understood that brute force alone wouldn't win the war. The British were entrenched in New York City, and a network of spies was urgently needed to anticipate their next move. Elias, with his proven loyalty, reserved demeanor, and professional skill as a carpenter, was an ideal, unremarkable candidate for a lethal trade, espionage. He was summoned to a secluded meeting with a colonel whose face he barely saw. The mission was absolute: penetrate the enemy's heart, the British headquarters in New York, and send back vital information about troop movements and supply lines. Elias was given a new identity: Amos Wood, a traveling hardware merchant seeking contracts in the city. The change was a profound psychological shock. He had to shed all vestiges of his identity as a soldier and citizen. He left his musket behind, replaced by a simple set of tools and a keen eye for detail. The true horror was the severance of his lifeline. To protect his family, he could have no contact with Sarah or his children. Discovery meant immediate execution as a spy, with no hope of reprieve or recognition. He had survived the physical dangers of war, but he now faced a crushing, silent war of nerves. Elias entered British-occupied New York City in late 1778. The city was a bewildering contrast to the starved continental camps, bustling, filled with loyalists and saturated with the presence of British redcoats and Hessian mercenaries. Every face was a potential informer, every careless word a fatal error. He rented a cramped, nondescript room near the docks, the epicenter of British logistics. His carpentry skills provided the perfect pretext for observation. He posed as a contractor seeking to sell timber or repair tools. He spent his days in shipyards, taverns and customs houses, not drinking or boasting, but listening to the complaints of drunken quartermasters, the casual boasts of young officers, and the financial woes of local merchants forced to work for the crown. His focus was forensic, the type of timber being unloaded, suggesting barracks or warships, the readiness of transport vessels, suggesting an impending attack, and the specific markings on supply crates, indicating which regiment was being reinforced. He had to be utterly unremarkable, fading into the background like a shadow on a cobblestone street. Elias's biggest hurdle was communicating his findings. His method had to be simple, secure, and repeatable. He was introduced to his handler, a patriot woman whose true name he never learned, known only by the code name The Weaver. Her cover was a modest laundry service in a busy part of the city. Elias developed a system using invisible ink, a mixture of ferrous sulfate and water, to write his highly coded reports on small slips of paper. His primary drop point was the weaver's shop. He would bring her a shirt for mending, and the urgent message would be meticulously sewn into the shirt's collar or cuff, or slipped into the hollowed heel of a worn boot. Every exchange was a terrifying gamble. Elias would enter the shop, his heart hammering, and discuss the supposed mending, his eyes constantly scanning the street for British patrols. "The stitching will be ready on Tuesday, Amos," the weaver would say, her eyes flat and empty of emotion. This was their coded confirmation. "The message has been received. Remain safe." The casual nature of the exchange was the only thing protecting their lives. Elias lived in a state of permanent dread, knowing that a simple lapse in composure could lead to the noose. The true war for Elias was fought alone, in the silence of his rented room. The constant suspicion, the forced deception, and the absolute lack of trust wore away at his soul. He had to assume every person he met was a loyalist informer. He perfected the art of drinking stale ale while remaining sober and smiling at redcoats while calculating their movements. He missed his family with an agonizing intensity. He would sometimes catch sight of a carpenter working with oak or pine and be momentarily flooded with the memory of his own workshop, his son Thomas handing him a tool, the warmth of Sarah's cooking. These brief flashes of his old life were exquisite torture, a profound psychological cost that made the cold and hunger of Valley Forge seem almost preferable. He knew he was sacrificing his sanity and his personal identity for the sake of the Union. In the spring of 1779, Elias noticed a sustained, highly unusual logistical operation around the city's main ferry points. A massive number of specialized horses, heavy wagons and detailed survey maps being guarded heavily. He risked his life to observe a dockyard at night, using his carpentry skills to scale a roof for a better vantage point. The discovery was immediate and critical. British engineers were loading extensive equipment, including pontoons, pieces necessary for building temporary bridges across major rivers. This was not a move for a skirmish. It was preparation for a major, decisive thrust to secure a strategic position, likely in the Hudson Highlands, or potentially threatening Washington's new camp. Elias rushed back to the Weaver. He wrote his message with shaking hands. Pontoons loading. South side. Target appears to be large river crossing. Urgent. He managed to make the drop without incident. Later that week, Washington's forces preemptively moved to secure the key defensive positions in the Highlands. When the British finally launched their movement, they found the Continentals ready and waiting. Elias never received direct confirmation, but the defensive success of the American forces was his silent reward. He had won a crucial, unseen battle, saving countless lives by trading his comfort for the shadows of espionage. The Union was safe, for now, because one man was willing to live as a ghost. The years of espionage and tension finally gave way to decisive action in the summer of 1781. General George Washington, his army stabilized but still unable to dislodge the British from New York, was waiting for a strategic opening. That opening was delivered by the French alliance. The British general, Lord Cornwallis, had foolishly positioned his large army in the coastal town of Yorktown, Virginia, relying on the British Navy to maintain his supply lines and, if necessary, to evacuate him. Washington and the French commander, Comte de Rochambeau, seized the opportunity. In a brilliant act of military deception, the Allied armies suddenly broke camp near New York, leaving behind a small force to maintain the illusion of a siege. Elias Thorne's regiment joined the main body for a rapid, grueling march south. Elias was elated. After years of running battles and secret missions, the army was finally moving toward a definitive, final confrontation. He marched shoulder to shoulder with the French soldiers. The white uniforms of Rochambeau's troops were a constant, elegant contrast to the tattered blue and brown of the Continentals. Though communication was difficult, the shared hardship of the journey, hundreds of miles in the August heat, forged a practical, powerful bond. The Americans provided the fierce determination. The French provided the professional planning, the funds, and the heavy artillery needed to win. The land march, though essential, was secondary to the action taking place at sea. The hinge upon which the entire operation turned was the French Navy. As the Allied forces marched into Virginia, news arrived that ignited a spontaneous, massive cheer throughout the ranks. Comte de Grasse's powerful French fleet had arrived from the Caribbean and had engaged a British fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake. The French had successfully repelled the British, securing absolute naval superiority and forcing the British fleet to retreat. Elias remembered the moment perfectly. The sound of the cheering running down the column for miles was the sweetest sound of the war. Cornwallis was no longer merely besieged. He was trapped. His supply and escape route was severed, leaving his army helpless, cut off from all support by a wall of French warships. The promise of the French alliance had finally been delivered, and it was decisive. The moment the Allied armies arrived at Yorktown, the methodical, brutal work of a European-style siege began. Elias's former trade as a carpenter now proved useful in his military role. Under the guidance of experienced French engineers, Elias and his regiment were tasked with digging the first parallel, a massive line of trenches parallel to the British defences, approximately 600 yards distant. The labour was immense and constant, carried out under the threat of British counterfire. They shovelled tons of earth, constructing breastworks and hauling heavy artillery pieces into position. On October the 9th, 1781, the Allied artillery barrage began. The sound was deafening, a continuous coordinated thunder from dozens of American and French cannons that shattered the morning stillness. Elias had heard heavy artillery before, but never with this concentration and fury. He watched through the smoke as shells systematically pulverized the British fortifications. The relentless noise was not just destruction. It was a loud psychological certainty of victory, signaling the desperation of the British trapped within the town. The last major obstacle to securing the siege line were two heavily fortified British outposts, redoubts 9 and 10. Their capture would allow the Allies to move their cannons to point-blank range. The assault, planned for the night of October 14th, was designed to demonstrate the flawless coordination of the alliance. The French would take Redoubt 9, and the Americans, led by Alexander Hamilton, would take Redoubt 10. Elias was in the American column. The orders were strict: no loading of muskets. The charge was to be made in silence, with fixed bayonets, a tribute to the discipline learned at Valley Forge. As they charged across the open ground, facing musket fire from the ramparts, Elias felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, but it was now controlled, disciplined. He scrambled over the earthen walls into the terrifying, chaotic darkness of hand-to-hand combat. He fought swiftly, instinctively, using the training von Steuben had instilled. The entire assault was over in a flash. The Americans, fighting with fierce resolve, overwhelmed the garrison in minutes. The sight of the American flag, the culmination of years of suffering, raised over Redoubt 10, mirrored by the French flag over Redoubt 9, was a powerful, symbolic victory. It confirmed that the combined strength of the Allies was an unstoppable force. The capture of the redoubts was the end. The Allies moved their artillery batteries so close that every shot was devastating. Cornwallis, with his defences ruined and his army starving, had no choice left. On the morning of October 17th, the cannons fell silent. Elias, standing in the cold, wet trenches, watched as a young drummer boy climbed the parapet and began to beat a slow, mournful signal, followed by a British officer waving a white flag of parley. The abrupt cessation of violence was overwhelming. After years of constant noise and terror, the silence felt heavy, unreal. Then the realization broke: the war, The decade of blood and sacrifice was over. A massive, roaring cheer erupted from the American lines, quickly joined by the shouts of the French. 2 days later, on October 19, 1781, the British Army marched out to formally surrender. Elias stood in the ranks watching the enemy, defeated, demoralized and ragged, lay down their arms. Cornwallis, refusing to face the humiliation, claimed illness and sent his second-in-command to hand over his sword. Elias watched the ceremonial stacking of muskets with a profound, quiet emotion. He thought of Lexington's dead, Valley Forge's starvation, and the secret drops of the spy network. The joy of final victory was immense, but it was a solemn, shared emotion born of immense sacrifice. The war was decisively won. They had not just defeated an army, they had created a nation. The exhilaration of Yorktown was a memory Elias Thorne clung to, but it did little to warm the cold reality of the post-war months. The victory had not ended the conflict. It had merely paused it. For nearly 2 agonizing years, Elias remained in the Continental Army, stationed in restless limbo near the Hudson Highlands. The British still held New York City, and until the Treaty of Paris was formally signed, the army dared not disband. This period was a relentless anticlimax. The soldiers who had endured Valley Forge now faced a new, insidious enemy: destitution. Congress, crippled by war debt and possessing no power to compel the states for funds under the Articles of Confederation, had no money to pay its troops. Elias, like thousands of others, was owed years of back wages. The revolutionary ideal felt cruelly betrayed by the civilian government they had risked everything to protect. The atmosphere was thick with discontent. The spectre of mutiny loomed, culminating in the Newburgh Crisis in March 1783, when officers, desperate for their promised pensions, considered marching on Congress. Elias witnessed the power of George Washington one last time. By appealing to their shared sacrifice and his own integrity, Washington averted a military coup, ensuring that the new nation would be governed by law, not by the sword. This quiet victory was arguably as important as Yorktown, but it did nothing to fill the soldiers' empty pockets. When the Treaty of Paris finally confirmed American independence in September 1783, the army was hastily disbanded. There were no parades for the rank and file. Elias received his final discharge papers signed by Washington, declaring him a free man. His pay, however, was a cruel joke, a scattering of devalued continental paper currency and certificates promising future payment that were essentially worthless to a poor veteran. Elias walked away from the army with profound ambivalence. He had won the war, but he had lost years of his life, his profession, and his physical health. The emotional farewells to his comrades, the men with whom he had shared blood and hunger, were painful. The disbandment was not a celebration. It was a scattering of veterans, unpaid and disillusioned, into an economy that had no place for them. The transition from soldier to citizen was immediate and jarring. Elias was conditioned to the rhythm of military life and the clarity of purpose. Now the civilian world felt chaotic and indifferent. He was a hero in principle, but a penniless beggar in reality. Elias's return to Boston was a moment of profound, complex emotion. He found Sarah, weary but unbroken, and his children, Thomas and Lydia, older and changed. The embrace with Sarah was an affirmation of their survival, but the economic reality was devastating. Sarah confessed that, unable to pay taxes and feed the children during the lean years, she had been forced to sell his life's investment. his entire collection of master carpenter's tools. The workshop stood an empty shell.
"I kept them alive, Elias," she whispered, tears finally falling.
But I couldn't keep the shop. Elias stood amidst the ruin of his trade, his soldiers' wages worthless, and realized the immense scope of the unfinished business. They had won political liberty, but they faced total economic ruin. The promised land of the Republic was burdened by massive public debt and a broken credit system. The instability that plagued Elias's personal finances was magnified across the entire state. The Massachusetts government, dominated by merchant creditors, refused to issue paper money or offer debt relief. Instead, it demanded that taxes be paid in hard currency. Veterans who were unpaid by the federal government were now losing their farms and being sent to debtors' prison by their own state. Elias watched the frustration of his fellow Western Massachusetts veterans and farmers boil over into open insurrection. Led by Captain Daniel Shays, a former Continental Army officer like himself, armed farmers began closing courthouses to halt foreclosure proceedings. The sight of armed farmers rebelling against the government they had just created struck Elias with a terrifying irony. He had stood against the king's tyranny, but he could not in good conscience support rebellion against the new, legitimate, if ineffective, government. The terrifying threat of Shays Rebellion was this: the revolution was failing from within. The Articles of Confederation government was powerless to raise an army to stop the uprising, forcing wealthy Boston merchants to privately fund a militia to crush the revolt. The war was against the king, Elias lamented to Sarah. This is patriot against patriot. If our own people will destroy the law, what was the use of the fight? The suppression of Shays Rebellion in early 1787 provided no lasting comfort. It merely proved that the Articles of Confederation were utterly incapable of governing the nation. The government that had won independence was now destroying the economic lives of its own war veterans, leading to anarchy. Elias understood that the foundation of liberty required the stability of law. He had sacrificed his personal comfort for political freedom. Now he realized that the final, most important fight was not on the battlefield, but in the political arena. The failures of the past 3 years, the unpaid wages, the bankrupt economy, the fear of civil war were all symptoms of a weak national government. The hard-won liberty could not endure without a powerful, functioning union. The final, essential task of the revolution, creating a lasting government, was just beginning. The veterans had cleared the ground, but the architects were needed to build the edifice. The winter of 1786 and the subsequent suppression of Shays Rebellion left a deep psychological scar on Elias Thorne. He had fought the tyranny of a king only to see his fellow veterans take up arms against the government they had sacrificed everything to create. The incident, happening right in his home state of Massachusetts, was undeniable proof that the Articles of Confederation government was a failed experiment. The peace without a plan was collapsing into chaos. "We exchanged a distant king for 13 petty tyrants," Elias lamented to Sarah, gesturing at his empty workshop, unable to find regular work amidst the economic collapse. "We have liberty to starve, but no government strong enough to pay its debts or prevent civil war." When news spread that a convention was called for in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ostensibly to amend the Articles, Elias felt a flicker of the old hope. He knew the true stakes. The gentlemen gathering there were not patching an old garment. They were weaving a new nation. By sheer chance, Elias secured a modest commission to deliver a specially crafted set of naval tools to a merchant in Philadelphia that summer. The trip was a financial risk, but it provided him a unique opportunity to be near the historic gathering. He spent his free hours in the stifling, humid heat, standing near the Pennsylvania State House, Independence Hall, the building where the Declaration had been signed and where the delegates now met in secret. Elias, the common veteran and victim of the economic turmoil, stood as a silent, visible embodiment of the crisis they were attempting to solve. He watched the arrivals, the regal figure of General George Washington, whose very presence guaranteed the legitimacy of the proceedings, the cerebral, quiet James Madison, whom many called the father of the Constitution, and the aging, diplomatic Benjamin Franklin. Elias realized that the men inside, though brilliant, were operating under the profound pressure of the people they were meant to serve, people like himself, who needed order and stability to make their liberty meaningful. The debates raging inside, though cloaked in secrecy, were echoed in the taverns and newspapers Elias frequented. He understood the central, agonizing dilemma: how to create a government strong enough to govern, levy taxes, raise an army, regulate commerce, without being strong enough to oppress, becoming a new tyranny. Elias felt the pain of the Great Compromise most keenly. The argument between large states, wanting representation by population, like the Virginia Plan, and small states wanting equal representation, like the New Jersey Plan, threatened to tear the convention apart. The resulting structure, a House of Representatives based on population and a Senate based on equal state representation, was a masterpiece of pragmatism. It was a victory for the art of governance, not perfect, but possible. But the compromise that truly wounded Elias's conscience was the 3/5 compromise, which allowed southern states to count 3/5 of their enslaved population for the purpose of representation. As a man who had fought for the universal principle of liberty, he saw this as a moral capitulation, a bitter concession to secure the fragile union. The shame of that compromise was the scar the new republic would carry from its birth. In September 1787, the delegates emerged and presented the finalized document. Elias obtained a printed copy and read it by the light of a flickering tavern lamp. The language that resonated deepest with him was the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. This phrase was the climax of the revolution. It confirmed that the source of government power lay not in a king, not in a parliament, but in the sovereign will of the ordinary citizen, the veteran, the former spy, the starving farmer. They were the people. Elias realized the true weight of his sacrifices. The blood spilled at Lexington, the endurance at Valley Forge, and the humiliation of his empty pockets were all paid to win the right to utter those words. The war had won independence. The Constitution was the plan to make that independence endure. Elias returned to Massachusetts not as a defeated veteran, but as an ardent advocate for the new republic. He joined the local effort to secure ratification, debating the merits of the Federalist cause in taverns, arguing that the new system, with its checks and balances and its power to stabilize the economy, was the only guarantee against further anarchy. He was one of the many veterans who had fought the military war and now had to fight the political one. The war had demanded their physical courage, The ratification process demanded their civic wisdom. Standing in his empty Boston workshop, Elias looked at the single, heavy hand plane he had managed to save. He knew he was a master carpenter who had to rebuild his trade from scratch, but he also understood his new lifelong role in the new republic. The political edifice was built not with wood and nails, but with laws and consent. The challenges of building a stable, lasting democracy were immense. The struggle for justice, for equality, and for economic stability was far from over. But the foundation had been laid. Elias Thorne, having survived the decade of fire, settled into his life as a dedicated, debt-ridden citizen, ready to guard the Constitution as fiercely as he had once guarded the battlements of Yorktown. The American dream would not be built in a day, but the tools to build it, the tools of self-governance, were finally in his hands.